Hello, welcome back to Podcast Like a Pro. Today we're going to be talking all about podcast SEO and how to improve your natural search engine rankings within iTunes. iTunes is the third biggest search engine in the world, so if you're not taking advantage of the built-in power of search within iTunes, you're really missing out on something here. We're going to show you how to optimize your show all for podcast SEO so that new people can find your show within iTunes. So what is iTunes SEO all about? So we're gonna go through kind of some of the nuts and bolts and considerations and best practices for you to set your show up for success so that new people can find your podcast within iTunes. So what exactly is podcast SEO? So it is all about what we have highlighted here, which is when people type in a key phrase in the top right area of iTunes, this is what they're going to be looking for. So in this case, we're looking for Podcast Motor. We're searching for Podcast Motor, and it would show the results for Podcast Motor here. We have a mix of both episodes for the Podcast Motor show as well as for our show as a whole and our podcast down here. You can see other podcasts that we've been mentioned on and interviewed for, and that's where other shows have done a good job of podcast SEO to include our keyword and the name of our business in their metadata in their podcast SEO. So this is kind of what you're shooting for when you're looking at podcast SEO is how can you get ranked both on an episode basis and on a podcast as a whole basis when someone types in a key term that you might be ranking for in iTunes. So just a disclaimer here, podcast SEO will not affect the new and noteworthy section in iTunes. We'll talk about new and noteworthy later when we talk about how to launch. But new and noteworthy is only the first 8 weeks of a new show and has a lot to do with the change in time of your downloads, ratings, and reviews and subscriptions. We'll talk more about that in detail later, but podcast SEO does not affect new and noteworthy. It only affects the natural ability for people to find your show when they search for a key term in iTunes. So getting into the details of how we have our show set up a little bit, you'll notice that there's a little bit of keyword density within our show metadata. So the name of the show is the Podcast Motor Show, and so that's fairly concise. People should know what that's about. So it's about podcasting. It has to do with Podcast Motor. If our brand is recognizable, then that would really trigger good things for you. But then we get down here into some of the places where we can insert keywords, and the first is the host name. So my name with some keywords followed after it, and this little symbol right here is the pipe on a keyboard. It's just above the return button, and this is a nice way to kind of separate your name from some keywords about you. So in here I have Podcast Motor as a keyword and Podcasting Enthusiast as kind of description of who I am. And then down here in the description area, you want to really be smart about the keywords that you use here. You don't want to be, spammy and have SEO sort of looking description, but you want it to be natural and optimized for the people who are going to be listening to your show and searching for it. But you also want to be smart about including keywords in here that are relevant to things that you think people might be searching for your show with. And so these two fields are places that we really see people who are very successful, using keywords to their advantage. The place that we don't do, but we could, is up here in the title. You say the Podcast Motor Show, interviewing the best and brightest podcasters in iTunes, or something like that. We could do that here, and that would include some more keyword density. It's just something we've chosen not to do just for brevity's sake. So one thing you can see here is we've formatted the title of our episodes to be pretty concise and short here. One thing that you'll notice, even in iTunes, and this is on a desktop, is that the title field in iTunes doesn't have a lot of space, right? You're only getting maybe 100 characters here. If you had written out the Podcast Motor Show episode 29, you'd be all the way over to here before you could start telling people what this is actually about. But we just use a 3-digit episode number and then a colon and then the title of the episode here. This is giving people a really good feel for what the show is going to be about. And the same with the description. You don't want to use a bunch of prose here that drolls on and on for a long time without telling people what it's actually about, because you have a limited amount of space here that you can actually kind of relay that information within iTunes. A description like show notes is much more lengthy, But thinking about title and description here in iTunes, you want it to be pretty brief and to the point so people can see it, especially on a smaller screen like on an iPhone. They just don't have that much real estate. So talking about episode titles specifically, there's a few things you want to keep in mind. And the first is you want it to be descriptive. Being kind of cute and fancy is neat, and that's fine. But you really want it to be descriptive and tell a potential listener exactly what the episode's going to cover. As we talked about, you want it to be front-loaded. Think about the real estate, especially on a small phone. You're only going to have maybe 50 characters that they'll be able to see without clicking on an episode to see what your episode is all about. You want it to be short. Again, talking about that real estate, don't front-load a bunch of information on your titles, your episode screen that isn't really relevant or descriptive to that specific episode. And then you want to tell people why it's compelling and has a benefit to them. What would they get out of listening to your episode? And then, I think it should be unique, it should be clever, and it should stand out, because the fact is there's a lot going on in iTunes right now. And the more that you can stand out with the podcast episode title, the better it'll be for your existing subscribers to actually listen to the episode, but for new people to find you as well. And a couple other factors to consider here. Things that have an intrinsic benefit to your show as a whole. If someone finds your show through the search engine, some things that would help convert them to a listener, a subscriber, are having a good number of ratings and reviews. That provides social proof of your show that it's good and people enjoy it and it's successful. A high subscription rate, so strong calls to action within the show itself and within the supporting show notes and things like that to have people subscribe to your show so they automatically download every episode. A good looking cover art that's concise and clean and relays the message, again, especially on a small screen. iTunes requires between 1400 by 1400 pixels up all the way up to 3000 by 3000 pixels, which is a really huge image. But if you think about an older iPhone and there's 4 or 5 or 6 of those images on a screen, it's going to be really tough for you to be able to tell what an image is about or a show is all about from its image if the font is really smaller. There's a bunch of it and a bunch of colors going around, so simple. So when you're designing your image, think about it needs to be simple. The font needs to be large and bold, maybe one image or something like that, but don't make it overly complicated. You should clearly relay what the show is about, what the benefit is for potential listeners. And then we touched on it briefly before, but keyword density. So how can you smartly and appropriately and in good taste use keywords in your titles and metadata for your podcast so that iTunes as a search engine can find your show easier? So that's really all that we'll cover with podcast SEO. Just think about how you can kind of smartly set your show up for success in iTunes by including relevant and appropriate information about your podcast so that potential listeners can find you, subscribe to your show, and enjoy your content.